Biker laughs while kicking dog unaware. It belongs to Jason Statham. That's not a headline. That's a mistake. Because the man who threw that kick didn't just hit a dog, he hit a ghost from a life no one dared speak of anymore. And he did. It laughing Mishka didn't bark. She didn't even bite. She was just old, loyal, lying near the shop entrance like she always did, nose tucked under her paw, waiting. She'd been waiting 3 years through blizzards, closed streets, power cuts because someone once told her to stay. And dogs like Mishka don't forget voices like that, not even when they disappear. The biker walked by with a pack behind him, all noise and ego. He stepped over her, then turned back, annoyed by the sight of weakness. He grinned. Cruelty, when public, becomes performance. The boot came down, hard. Her yelp cut through the square like a gunshot. People watched. Some flinched, some filmed, but no one moved, except one man standing still across the street. Hood up, face down, hands clenched. Jason Statham. He didn't yell, didn't run. Just crossed the street with a kind of calm that made the air shift. The kind of calm you only earn from losing too much too young, and surviving anyway. Mishka had been his mother's dog, her last companion before the pills, before the letters, before the cameras stopped calling. Jason had left the red carpets behind when she died, left the name, the money, the noise, but not Mishka, never her. He knelt, touched the dog's trembling body like it was glass. Then he stood, slowly, deliberately, and finally, the biker saw who he was, and realized what he'd done. Too late. He didn't speak to anyone for days after the incident. Not the police officer who showed up late. Not the shaky-handed vet who stitched Mishka back together. And certainly not the shopkeeper who finally came out after everything had already ended. Jason sat alone in the tiny apartment above his mother's shuttered bookstore, curtains drawn, lights off, listening to Mishka's breathing as if it were the only thread still tying him to this life. The town didn't welcome him back. Not really. Whispers spread fast in places like Koryazma. They said he came back because he had nowhere else to go. That he was broke. That Hollywood had chewed him up and spat him out. And now he was just another washed-up name, hiding behind old buildings and older shame. No one asked why he left the movies. No one remembered the hospital visits, the court battles, the years spent trying to pull his mother out of the addiction she sank into. When fame replaced family. When he walked to the corner shop for bread, people turned. Some stared. Most didn't speak. One woman, clearly drunk, leaned out of a bar doorway and slurred. Should have kicked the dog harder. Maybe it'd teach you how to act again. Jason said nothing, just kept walking. That was what he did now. Walked. Fed Mishka. Sat quietly and listened. Even Mishka, stitched and sore, seemed changed. She no longer wagged her tail when she heard his footsteps. She simply rested her head on his boot, breathing shallowly, as if afraid the world might take her too. The bookstore below hadn't opened in years. His mother had died with a list of unpaid debts pinned to the back of the register. Jason never cleared them. He didn't want to erase her failures. They were hers to own. But sometimes at night, he sat on the dusty floor beside her chair and read aloud from the same tattered novels she used to love. The air still held a trace of her lavender tea. The town had no space for softness. The landlord threatened eviction, calling him a squatter, despite the lease he'd inherited. His old classmates passed him like he was invisible. Even children pointed at Mishka, now calling her broken, ugly, trash dog. And Jason, once the name above box offices, now flinched when kids laughed too loud, because laughter here didn't sound kind. It sounded like the biker's laugh, like the one that echoed every time he closed his eyes. But then, something shifted. It was a boy, maybe 10, red scarf, mismatched shoes. He didn't speak, just left a piece of paper outside the bookstore and ran. Jason found it later, folded and damp with snow. A drawing, him, standing next to Mishka, both smiling. No words, just crayon strokes and a heart at the bottom. The next day, a metal food bowl appeared near the steps, full. Then an old man Jason didn't recognize nodded at him by the market and murmured, "Good dog. She's tough, like her owner." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't redemption, but it was something in the quiet, unnoticed corners of a town that had forgotten how to be gentle. Jason felt something he hadn't felt in years, the faintest seed of hope. The opportunity came in a whisper, barely louder than the rustling of snow against the shop window. Old Irina, who ran the bakery 2 doors down, stopped Jason one morning while he was walking Mishka. She didn't smile, just handed him a rusted key and said, "I heard your mother used to run readings for the kids. Maybe you should start again. They don't listen to anyone anymore." Jason stood there for a long time, key in his hand, wondering if it was a joke. But Irina had already gone back inside, the bell above her door jingling like it always did, as if nothing had happened. He stared at the bookstores locked that afternoon, key clenched so tightly it left marks in his palm. The windows were fogged, the signs still crooked. Nothing had moved in years, and still, Mishka wagged her tail, just once, as if she remembered too. That night, he sat inside for the first time in months, surrounded by untouched shelves and the scent of dust and forgotten pages. He touched the table where his mother used to sit, her chipped mug always steaming beside her. He remembered her voice, soft but tired, reading poetry to children who came not for the books, but for the warmth she offered without question. He tried not to remember the last time she sat here, when the bookstore was empty, and her hands trembled too much to hold a cup. "They only loved you when you were strong," she had whispered then. "You stopped acting, and they stopped asking how I was." Jason hadn't known what to say, so he left. For a shoot, for a paycheck, for anything that felt like control. When he returned, she was gone. Now, sitting in that same chair, he whispered aloud, "I'm sorry," to no one but the walls. The next day, he cleaned, slowly, methodically, not for anyone else, but because the silence was finally unbearable. He scrubbed windows until his knuckles cracked, sorted books until his hands bled. He worked through old invoices, found receipts still scrawled in his mother's handwriting, delicate and looping, like she'd hoped someone would one day read them with care. But when the time came to open the door to the public, his hand froze at the knob. He thought of the tabloids, of the paparazzi, of the awards that meant nothing, of the funeral with only 4 mourners, of the voicemail from a producer saying, "It's bad optics to cast you now," of the night he stood on a hotel balcony wondering if it would feel like flying, before it felt like falling. He didn't open the door that day, or the next. It took 3 more mornings of Mishka pawing at the threshold, and the sound of children laughing outside, carefree, unaware, unburdened, before he finally turned the key and pushed it open. The first child to walk in was the boy with the red scarf. He didn't say anything, just sat cross-legged by the heater and waited. Jason sat across from him, opened a worn copy of The Snow Queen, and began to read. His voice cracked on the first page, but he kept going. The children came, not in crowds, not at first, but steadily. A pair of sisters with frostbitten cheeks, who clutched each other's hands as they listened. A boy with burned scars along his jaw, who never spoke, only nodded when asked if he wanted another story. And every day, Mishka lay beside them like an old guardian, her stitched belly rising and falling in rhythm with Jason's voice. Something fragile began to grow. Irina dropped off pastries in silence. Someone from the hardware store replaced the shop's broken heater without asking for payment, and an anonymous envelope with enough cash to clear half the rent appeared wedged under the door. Jason didn't dare believe it, but he allowed himself to breathe just a little. For a moment, it felt like he was building something real, something his mother would have loved, something worth staying for. But then came the letter, typed, cold, official. An eviction notice. The landlord had sold the building quietly, without warning. The new owner had development plans, a cafe, a co-working space, something modern. Jason had 20 days to leave. He stood in the shop's center, holding the letter with hands that refused to stop shaking. The bookshelves he had just repaired, the walls he had scrubbed raw, the heater that finally worked, all of it would be dust again. Mishka whimpered at his feet, not from pain, just from knowing. She had seen this before. Abandonment had a smell. Jason sat down hard on the floorboards, staring up at the ceiling like it could give him a reason not to scream. He wanted to rage. He wanted to break something. But instead, he felt that the weight he'd carried for years pressing back down with familiar cruelty. He thought of calling someone, a lawyer, an old friend, a reporter, but no one returned calls anymore. Not after he walked away from the industry that made him. He'd wanted peace, chose anonymity, chose grief, and now, like everything else in his life, even that quiet had betrayed him. He buried his face in Mishka's fur and whispered, "Why did I think I deserved a second chance?" Memories rushed in like a tide, his mother sitting alone in that chair, asking if he'd be home for her birthday. His silence, the way she smiled anyway and said, "That's okay, I'll wait." He had always been late. Too late to fix things. Too late to show up. Too late to show up. And now, he was losing the last place where she still felt real. 4 hours. He stayed on that floor. The shop dark. The books untouched. The silence louder than ever. Not even Mishka moved. Because sometimes, when a man who's been strong too long finally breaks, he does so quietly and completely. The next morning, he didn't rise with purpose. He rose because Mishka nudged his hand, and her eyes, dim but steady, were asking one more time. He fed her, brushed her fur, then sat beside the shop window and stared out at the street that had never welcomed him, but no longer pushed him away. Snow dusted the sidewalk. Children passed in coats too thin for winter, their breath clouding the air. One boy paused and peered in. Jason didn't wave, but he didn't look away either. By noon, a knock came at the door. It was the boy with the red scarf, no words, just a folded note in his mitten. Jason opened it slowly. It read, "My sister says she wants to learn to read. She's scared, but if you read with her, she won't be." Jason folded the note back with shaking hands. He opened the door wide. They came in slowly that afternoon, just 4 of them. No fanfare, no announcement, just quiet footsteps, red cheeks, and expectant eyes. And something inside Jason clicked, not duty, not pride, but something cleaner, like peace beginning to show itself through service. He taught the girl to read 1 word at a time. He gave her her first book, let her take it home, didn't even ask for it back. And slowly, something shifted inside him, not just healing, but ownership of his grief, of his guilt, of his place in the world. That night, he made a choice. He wrote a letter not to fight the eviction, but to tell the truth. He wrote it for the town, for the families, for the children who sat cross-legged by his feet, for the ones who didn't speak but listened, for the ones who saw kindness in a quiet man reading stories beside an injured dog. He posted it on the bookstore door, on scrap paper, taped with care. It simply said, "If they take this place, they take it." But stories don't live in walls. They live in voices. So I'll keep reading. At the park, at the bakery, on doorsteps if I have to. Wherever. Someone needs to hear one. Then, with Mishka beside him, Jason lit a single candle in the window. He wasn't asking for help. He was offering light. And somehow, that was stronger. The candle in the window burned every night for a week. On the 8th day, the landlord came. Not a letter this time. In person. Tall, smug, wrapped in a scarf worth more than the building. He stepped into the shop like he owned it already, which on paper, he did. Jason stood behind the counter, a child perched beside him, tracing. Words in a picture book. Mishka lay curled beneath the stool. The landlord's shoes clicked loudly on the floorboards. "You've had your notice," he said flatly. "Pack up, it's over." Jason didn't argue. He looked the man in the eye, calm as a frozen lake, and said, "Then you'll have to tell them." And he gestured toward the children. There were more now. They sat near the heater, reading quietly, some drawing, some humming. One boy stood behind the counter like a little assistant, waiting for Jason to finish a sentence. None of them looked up, but all of them were listening. The landlord hesitated. That wasn't part of the script. His jaw twitched. "It's not a registered nonprofit," he snapped. "No permit, no business license. It's squatters and sentiment, that's all." Then a voice came from the doorway. "You're wrong." It was Irina, her flour-dusted apron still tied around her waist. Behind her stood half the block shopkeepers, teachers, a few parents, even the old man from the hardware store. "He's not running a business," she said. "He's keeping our children off the street. He's doing what the rest of us forgot how to do." The landlord looked around. The silence swallowed him. This wasn't anger. It was quiet resistance, heavy, unyielding. And then, something even stranger happened. One of the children stood and placed a book into the landlord's hand. "You can have this," she said softly, "but only if you promise to read it out loud." Jason watched him freeze, book in hand, surrounded by the very people he'd once ignored. There was no shouting, no threats, just a town that had decided, without fanfare, that this space mattered, that the man who had once left them behind had somehow come back, not to be their star, but to be their storyteller. The landlord said nothing, just turned and left. Jason didn't chase him, didn't speak. He just looked at the girl who had given up her book and smiled through the tears he could no longer hide. Because in that moment, he understood. He had always chased applause, validation, a stage. But here, in this little shop, with a stitched-up dog and a circle of listening children, he had finally found what he had never known he needed, a reason to stay. Years passed, quietly, like pages turning in a book no one wanted to end. The bookstore never became a cafe. The landlord never returned, and though the building never looked perfect, paint peeling in corners, the windows forever a little foggy, it stayed open, not as a shop, not as a business, but as a haven. Jason never put up a sign. He didn't need to. People just knew. Children came after school with cold hands and open hearts. Teenagers came on days they didn't know who they were. Adults came, some to listen, some to remember. And Mishka, though slower now, always greeted them at the door like she was welcoming them home. Jason read every day, sometimes to just one person, sometimes to a room full. He read stories of magic and loss, of bravery and love. But the greatest story, the one they would speak of long after he was gone, was not written in any book. It was how he stayed, how a man who had every reason to run chose to return, chose to forgive a town that once turned its back, chose to become something smaller and quieter, but infinitely more human. In time, the children grew. One became a teacher, another a writer. One girl, once afraid to read aloud, stood before a crowded hall and said, "I learned my voice in a forgotten bookstore, from a man who never once asked me to be anything but myself." Jason never went back to acting, never needed to. He grew old in that same creaky chair, Mishka's head resting on his boot until the very end. And when she was gone, he lit a candle again, not for grief, but gratitude. He had once believed love had to be earned, fame, chased, redemption, impossible. But now he knew. Sometimes the smallest act a story read, a door opened, a dog saved, was enough to change a life. Or many, and on quiet winter nights, when the snow piled high and laughter echoed from inside the town, knew he hadn't just come home, he had become it.